Sometimes as moms, we just underestimate the power that we have in the spiritual formation of our children. We don't really give it as much weight as it should. And so I think that's a big part of it, is just cultivating a sacred life in our children and in our home. Even if your children are grown, you don't have to just give up. This is still your home, your monastery. You could still establish some sacred practices.
My name is Lisa, mother of 8 and creator of the blog and YouTube channel Farmhouse on Boone. Join me as I share with you my love for creating a handmade home, from scratch cooking, and a little mom and entrepreneur life along the way. Welcome back to the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. Today, I'm having on Jennifer Pepito. She just wrote a brand new book, which is out next month, called Habits for a Sacred Home. In it, she discusses when the world is chaotic, which is honestly throughout history, it's pretty common, looking to these simple practices that create a rhythm in your home that will produce kids of character. A lot of us as moms, that's what we want to do, despite what all is going on around. And she says this all so much more eloquently, so encouraging. So let's dive into this great conversation. Right. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us here on the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. I was just reading through your book, or I don't know, when does your book actually come out? Because I think I have the copy that's like a little bit early, which is super fun, and I'm really enjoying it so far. So tell us about your book and when it comes out, and then we're going to discuss that concept. So Habits for a Sacred Home.
That's right. So Habits for a Sacred Home releases May 7th, but it's available for pre-order now.
Okay.
And it's really about spiritual disciplines for moms.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was reading through it to get the basic idea, and I already can relate so much. So it's talking about how all of these people that we look up to in the faith for years, like, centuries back, things that they've gone through. Like, we think sometimes the way the world is now is unique and special in that it's crazy, everything's getting worse. And in a lot of ways, I think we forget that this is kind of how history works, and people have still maintained these sacred habits and raised their kids almost in a different way than just with the culture. So yeah, let's start with kind of an overview of what the book is about.
Yeah. So I actually got really scared. I wrote a book about overcoming fear. We talked about it. It's Mothering by the Book. And during 2020, though, like COVID and all the lockdowns and mandates and everything, I got kind of scared for the world. And during that time, I read a book by Rod Dreher called The Benedict Option. And in that book, he talks about how the Benedictines also lived through the Dark Ages, and the spiritual disciplines that they engaged in, with what Benedict called a rule of life, actually helped them save civilization. And it made me feel like not only do we as moms have the power to create sort of little peaceful oasis in our home, but we're also saving civilization. Like, as we read sacred books to our children, or even just read any book that was written in history and has a hopeful worldview, we're saving civilization. As we continue praying together, as we host people in our home, all of these little historic Christian habits that we're doing have a really powerful impact, not just on our home and our family, but culture in general.
Yeah. So what is this? Maybe break down the way that at least I see a lot of Christians, sometimes including myself, are doing things in a way that's kind of different from this, almost like trying to change the world around us. And not that there can't be some change brought to it, but I think sometimes we maybe waste too much energy on trying to change it, as opposed to just keeping on with what we're supposed to be doing without having to know everything, be involved in everything. That can be sort of something that we can fall down in a rabbit hole of. So how do you sometimes see moms and homeschooling moms and Christian moms doing this a bit differently?
Yeah. And that was one of the really hopeful things too, because I feel like sometimes we feel like if we're not, Matt Walsh or something, we're not really changing the world.
Yes.
Like, we don't have this huge impact. But a lot of these women, like Edith Schaefer, Amy Carmichael, Elizabeth Elliot, their kind of impact on culture wasn't necessarily seen in the midst of them living out their lives as missionaries or moms. Do you know what I mean? Like, a lot of the impact happened later, or, maybe their book sort of began to be disseminated. Like, I read Edith Schaefer's daughter's books, Susan Schaefer Macaulay, her book For the Family's Sake, for the
Hmm.
Children's Sake. Those
Yeah.
have changed so many of our lives as mothers. And yet Edith was just faithfully, making food for all these people
Oh,
and
yeah.
being willing to open her home to people, doing these little things that were sort of underappreciated probably at the time or didn't feel like a lot. And yet she's had this huge impact on culture. So I feel like as moms, we don't have to underestimate the power of just changing the diaper cheerfully or just reading, doing morning time with our kids instead of hopping online. Like there's so many little things that we're doing that are actually very impactful. And just like you look at the life of Jesus, even, I mean, he very strategically poured himself into 3 people, into 12 people. And so there were crowds that gathered, but also his strategic and intentional pouring into a smaller community are probably what made the bigger impact than the crowds that gathered while he was alive.
Yeah. And, for us, we can't always see the big picture or the future. We can't see that at all. So it's hard sometimes to actually believe that that matters. So you talk about creating a sacred home. What is a sacred home?
It's interesting because I think sometimes that word sacred can be like, ooh, kind of
Yeah.
up here. But I love in Charlotte May, Susan Schaefer Macaulay's book, she talks about how Saint Benedict was creating schools for the service of the Lord. And I feel like that's what we're doing in our homes is we are creating homes for the service of the Lord. Like I'm not just homeschooling my children. I'm raising up people who love Jesus. And I just am going through Tish Oxenreider's Rule of Life course right now. And she says that as Christians, our aim is to become saints. And the way we become saints is to continually say yes to God. And I think, as like I'm not Catholic. And so I wouldn't necessarily say saint. I wouldn't think about it maybe in the same terms as she would as a Catholic believer. But the idea that our lives as humans, as people creating God's images to continually say yes to God. And so then in our homes, what we're doing is just creating little homes where together we say yes to God, that we don't just tack on a little bit of spiritual disciplines after we do all of the other homeschooling, like that we infuse our homes with maybe for you, it's hymns and poetry that really reflect God's goodness. Or maybe for another family, it's going to be like worship and evangelism or something. Like we're all kind of created and called differently, but just that we look at our homes, not just as a place to get our kids out of the house. Do you know what I mean? Not just a place to kind of
Right.
push them out, but that it's a place where we're actually raising little contemplatives. I just talked to Michelle Garrels, Josh Garrels' wife on my podcast. And she was talking about how, she is like nurturing her children, almost like a pastor would nurture a flock. And I think sometimes as moms, we just underestimate the power that we have in the spiritual formation of our children. And we don't really give it as much weight as it should. And so I think that's a big part of it is just cultivating a sacred life in our children and in our home. And despite where you are, because even if your children are grown, you don't have to just give up and be like, okay, fine, just go play your video games in your room. Like this is still your home, your monastery. You could still establish some sacred practices, even with teens and adults, where you call them in for an evening Bible time, or you call them together when you have somebody over to everybody like participates with a guest.
Hmm. Yeah. And all that you're saying is so different, I think, from the way that the regular culture works. And it could be tricky because most people don't have older women or anything to look to for an example like this. Of course, we have books, from people like you, which is awesome. And you were talking about some courses. What are, like, in essence, what are the habits and how do you, whenever life sometimes, like, I feel like for me, whenever I had a couple of little kids, this all felt very easy to do, right? Like I felt like I could just take my little brood of children and like read to them. And I felt very peaceful. And now I feel like, in a lot of ways, our home can go a lot of different directions because we have so many ages. And I know you raised a large family and a lot of them are older now. And so how did this look like amongst the daily chaos? Like in what ways did you also simplify your life so that you could establish some of these habits?
Yeah. And one of the things I really did is I just continued that morning time. And that's a big part of like the Peaceful Press homeschool resources is just that we gather all the ages. Cause I feel like people who are homeschooling, often when they get into junior high and high school, they get scared and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm going to put them in
Yeah.
online school. And then your kids all of a sudden have this big online community and it's not always productive. And I think one of the things that we can do is almost like an antidote, even if you do have to use some online classes, is just gathering them in every day to have this like morning time situation or a prayer time, just something where you're actually able to look your children in the eyes, kind of see how they're doing, get a gauge for where their spiritual development is, even as they grow. Instead of what people do is just like kind of almost give up as their children grow. And
Yeah.
also, in our home, like there's Deuteronomy 6 talks a lot about how we teach these things as we walk on the way and as we rise up and as we lie down. I think even just making sure that you're taking time to be present with your children. Cause I think often with teens and young adults, it's easy to think, oh, they're fine. They're on their own. They have their own friends, whatever. And we don't still take time to just be quiet in their presence so they can talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
But when we are quiet in their presence, that's when they will come to us with those behavior or friend or relational or communication issues that we can then speak life and truth into. And so I think, as they get older, it becomes more of a conversation as opposed to like a circle time,
Right.
but we still need to keep those connections open so that we can continue to help them develop spiritually. And I am really, I'm thankful that my children, as they've grown into adulthood and have had their own choices about life, have still continued to keep those spiritual practices of reading their Bibles or going to church or having a community of believers to learn and grow with.
Yeah, actually, recently I was telling that to Luke because, you start off the school year with this new sense of order and this is how we're going to do things. We're going to have this very strict routine. And then as the months go on, at this point, it's getting closer to, maybe a summer break if people do that and things can get a little bit more chaotic. And I was telling him, like, do we need to like regroup, like gather everybody around and make them all sit at the same table? Because we can tend to let everybody do their work, here and there. And I'm kind of feeling that lately, like maybe we need to get everybody together again, like for at least a short time throughout the day, because, it's hard when everybody's going in a lot of different directions. It can be tricky with a wide range of ages, which we have 15 years from the oldest to the youngest. And so it just can, like you said, sometimes like, okay, the older ones, you got it. You know what you have to do. You have your lessons, but then you can start to feel this chaos creep in whenever you do it that way.
It's true. And that's why, I still did the Peaceful Press even with my high schoolers, because I don't know if you've read the Thomas Jefferson Education by Oliver DeMille. He has one book for high school called Hero Education. And he just really recommends that the bulk of the high schooler's education is reading and discussing great books with a tutor. And so whether that's you or somebody else, I think that high schoolers still do need that community. And if they're not having it with you and your husband, or maybe even some other adults, like I apprentice my son out to some skilled people in our community as well. But I think if they're not having that community with their family, they're going to look for it online. And like I said, it's not always going to be a positive community
Right.
online.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Something you mentioned in the book that I have noticed. So I am not at the stage where I have kids out of the house yet. And so I could see this down the line. And something I've noticed with several families. And then I've also noticed what you said is the opposite way to treat this, which is the right way, is them, whenever their kids grow up, sometimes, we'll have these regrets about certain things that we didn't implement, certain habits we didn't do like we hoped we would have. And then kids still can stray because, they're humans and we all have our own free will. And I have noticed some moms that are, a generation older than me, changing their theology to like reflect what the kids have done. So I was reading that in your book. And then I also know of a family where she took the very faithful approach of just recognizing, yeah, I wasn't perfect, but she didn't, like you said, even if you're the only one, I thought that was really a good encouragement for moms who are maybe in their 50s, 60s, who have things didn't always turn out perfect. And, for me at this point, I'm not there yet. So it very well might be, but can you speak a little bit to that, what I'm trying to sum up here?
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up because it's really sad to pour so much into our kids and then have some of them not follow the same, path or whatever. And I've had a couple who kind of struggled in that path to adulthood. It does take nerves of steel. Do you know what I mean? But I
Yeah, I'm
think
sure.
the real problem happens in the church when the parents start, completely changing their own spiritual disciplines to accommodate their children's sin issues or their children's, differences of opinions. And it's great to learn from our kids. Like I love that I can always be learning from my adult children. But what I don't want is to lose my faith because of my children. And so I think for me, the most important thing I've done is forgive myself. Like if I can acknowledge, in my life as a mom, there's so many things that I did really well. Like I was so present with my kids in terms of physical presence. And I was so intentional in terms of, homeschooling and morning time and nature time and just all the beauty. But there are things like I fought with their dad, like every month or right around my period, I picked a fight with their dad, or, or I was a really scared mom in different seasons, or there was a season where we just had so much work to do that I kind of was just a taskmaster. And so there are regrets that I have. And so when those come up for me, I will forgive myself, very thoroughly, like, oh God, thank you for forgiveness. And I forgive myself. Cause I think so many moms really get weighed down with that regret and they sort of get
Hmm.
stuck there. And then they're even
Yeah.
less present with their kids because you can still repair adult relationships. Like there's still all this repair that can happen with your adult relationships. And then the other thing I do is if it's appropriate, I will express my sadness to my children about it. Like, hey, I was just thinking about this time and I wish that I had been more present and just really enjoying you more in this time when you were growing up and showing me your Lego creations. Or, if I can just take some time to really encourage them and show up for them and express some of that comfort to them, I think it will make a big difference in how they experience me because they will have a lot more grace for me and enjoyment of me as a person if I have had some grace for them and expressed express a little bit of remorse if it's appropriate so that your children don't feel, cause I think a lot of times children start to feel gaslit. Do you know what I mean? They start to feel like you just don't care and you're not listening if you always are defending yourself when they do come to you with something.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about some of the rhythms and habits that you mentioned in the book. So you have stewardship, hospitality, order, stability, and simplicity. So, how does this look practically day to day? I know that's a loaded question, but how, and you talked about coming together and having these maybe like set times throughout the day. How else do you implement this?
Yeah. In the book, I basically kind of compare these qualities in the lives of different people. So for instance, in the chapter on work, I talk about Edith Schaefer and how she approached work not as like, I'm a victim, but more as I am giving this work to God. Like I'm doing this as if unto the Lord. And so I think part of it, as far as these spiritual disciplines, is just adjusting our mindset because in some ways as moms, we have gotten like, I don't think that your community is that way because we're all willing to tackle, baking sourdough bread or making butter. We're willing to tackle some of these harder things. But I think in general, in culture, we've been sort of acclimatized to comfort. And so then the discomfort of getting up in the middle of the night with a baby or dealing with diapers or dealing with sickness, we can almost feel victimized by it. And so really, I feel like there are really some small practice adjustment. So in each chapter, I list, some ways that you could embrace work or some ways that you can embrace stewardship or simplicity. And in my restoration home community, we're actually going through a little set of habits each month. Like for instance, in January, we worked on just logging our time. So kind of keeping track of how we are actually spending our time because we can think that we're so burdened down by work and then realize, oh my gosh, I spent 2 hours online shopping, and
Right.
we've spent some time like decluttering every day because we can think that we have no time to look our children in the eyes. And actually what we're doing is spending like
Cleaning.
hours every day organizing our homeschool books. You know what I mean? So I
Right.
think that there are just some awareness practices even that can help us adjust to better habits, sacred habits, if you will. And
Hmm.
another one of those habits has been just, having a little bit of time set aside, even 15 minutes just to sort of think about like, how did I spend my day? Why did I feel so much unrest in this certain portion of the day? And, as we are maybe even a little bit more reflective about how we're spending our time, it can really help us engage more with our children. Because I think that one of the big reasons that our children will maybe leave the faith or leave our homes with a chip on their shoulder in some ways is just that they didn't feel connected to us. Like they didn't feel loved by us. And so often we maybe don't even feel that loved ourselves. And so as we just set aside a little bit more time just for being present, like that was a big value in the monasteries, even that there was a balance of work and prayer. And in that prayer time, they were reciting the Psalms. And in the Psalms, you can't help but feel loved and feel safe. Do you know what I mean? You can't help but feel like, oh, God is my refuge and ever present help. Oh, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. As we meditate on the truth that God does love us, I think it gives us like more of just a sense of peace that then we can go after habits instead of just always feeling so defeated. I think what often derails our habits is our numbing out practices. And our numbing out practices often come from feelings of unrest inside.
Right. Yeah. Or feeling like there's no way I'll ever be good at this. But that's the thing is every day there will be things that you fail in, and then there'll be things that work out, and you'd have to learn to not beat yourself up, but maybe look at those, reflect on them, and think about how you could do it better, but not necessarily beat yourself up for how you did it.
Absolutely. I mean, every day is like a fresh baby, fresh day. Like in
Right.
our group, we talk a lot about 1% improvement because for sure you're going to try and start tracking your time and following through on the chore charts. And then someone's going to get sick and everything's going to go out the window. But if we can just start like making progress, like, 10 seconds of eye contact a day or following through with 3 chores a day, just having some of these little simple habits, it's going to make such a big difference in just the overall progress of our homes. So, some of these habits, like I said, were represented in the lives of these moms. And I think one of the big parts of habit building that we've been doing through the life of the book and through the life of our home is just little baby steps. Like it doesn't mean trying to develop a sacred home doesn't mean that you put up like a family altar and you throw away your TV and you just do these rash and radical changes. It's just small things like taking time to even just read a psalm at night before your kids go to bed, or just say the Lord's Prayer together, or just stop complaining so much. Like there are really small things we can do to just adjust the atmosphere of the home towards one that is more encouraging and more uplifting and really helps us. Like, I feel like when we and our children have cultivated an awareness of how much God loves us, we are much less likely to go adopt false gods, like C.S. Lewis talks about how we're like these children and we're playing in the mud when there's a God who's given us this beauty. And I think that that's what we're trying to prevent in our the raising of our children is just, we're trying to give them access to God through practices, through disciplines, through being in a godly community, through singing together, through praying together, through reading the Bible, through just being a loving and present parent. And as we kind of nurture that in our homes, our children will be far less likely to go be a part of the problem in culture. But even so, at least we have nurtured our own hearts. Like no matter what, at least we have been faithful in our own homes and our own hearts to cultivate our faith in God and to cultivate our relationship with the Lord.
Yeah. And one thing I try to always remember as a mom is there's a lot of margin for error. You'll have love and care for your kids. You're not giving up. I always think that like, it's not, whenever I have hard days, I don't just give up and think, well, I guess just forget them, like I messed up today. You have a new fresh day. There's a lot of margin for error. Love covers a multitude of sins, being there and caring for them. And something that I've learned over the years is comparison isn't good. And we all know this, but it's so not good because everybody is so different. And one way that has been like the best thing probably for me is I have a sister who I guess our husbands must just be so different because our little children, though we are very similar, couldn't be more different from each other. And it's probably our favorite conversation in the world. We talk about it nonstop, the two of us. Like we just compare because it's so funny to see how different our kids are. And so just knowing that what might work for one family might not work for you because your family is so different. Like what works for me and my family and what works for her and her family are so different. And I've tried like doing her way, and I don't think she's ever tried doing my way, but I've tried doing her way, and it just doesn't work. Like we're just different people. And so, like you said, like cultivating these small habits, it might not look exactly like how it looks for somebody else based on the whole personality and culture of your family.
Yeah. And, I think if you look at the Bible, like there's not a single instance of a parent who raised a godly child or, like there's no formula. Do you know what I mean? Because you have
Yes.
a godly father like the Lord God himself who's raising Adam in the garden, then Adam ruins the whole world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think we've been given this idea that if we do things just perfectly, then our kids will be perfectly happy. But I think that's a false God right there. That's a false idol. And so I think we just be faithful. And I hope that's the main book or the main message of my book is it's just faithfulness. It's faithfulness in the little things. Like Psalm 37 says, trust in the Lord and do good. And so shalt thou dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. It's not this big magic. It's just doing the little things like smiling at our children and doing the dishes and inviting over a neighbor for coffee. It's the little things we do with love and faithfulness that will change the world.
Yeah. I like that. I think it's encouraging. I think it breaks it down into something that we don't feel like this is not actually possible because just this morning I did XYZ or a kid made me angry and I felt this way, just knowing that perfection isn't really the goal. Right, taking a break from this episode to tell you about one of my favorite sponsors, and that is Tubes & Co. Organic Skincare. Tubes & Co. is a small family-owned, made-in-America skincare company that specializes in organic skincare. So think grass-fed tallow, made balms, and all these cosmetic products and skincare products that have ingredients that you don't have to worry about putting on your body. So whenever you go through and check the ingredients in most skincare, you will find that a lot of it is not something that I personally feel comfortable with. So the skin is your body's largest organ, and what you put on it does actually make its way in. So it's very important to check all of those ingredients, and Tubes & Co. is one I don't have to worry about. I don't have to check, and it's all really great stuff. So I've been really prioritizing my skincare more lately, and I love their sea buckthorn cleansing oil. I follow that at night with the charcoal cleansing bar. Then I do the toner and the glow serum. I actually just ran out of the glow serum and I need to get some again because it makes my skin look so good when I go through that basic skincare routine. And then I also love their makeup, the foundation, the eyebrow pencil, their whole line of makeup. It's really good stuff, clean, and then also it looks beautiful. Works great as well. I have my whole family hooked on it. Tubes & Co. is offering Simple Farmhouse Life listeners 10% off your order by using the code FARMHOUSE over at Tubes & Co. That's like soups, but with a T, TOUPS and co.com. Don't forget to use the code FARMHOUSE. Now, you talk a lot about community. You just mentioned having someone over for coffee. What did this look like? What does this look like for you and your family fostering this community? That's something that I feel like I sometimes am good about. And then sometimes I feel like we haven't done anything with anybody except just family members for the last 3-4 months. So how did that look for you?
Well, I love that question so much because we have been very careful to create and protect family time. Do you know what I mean? We've been very careful as a family. Like we don't often take vacations with other families. Like we've been very careful to nurture our relationship with our children first, but we've always been hospitable to strangers. Like in the book, I talk about how this group of Czechoslovakian, and I know it's not Czechoslovakia anymore, but at the time it was, they drove down our country lane looking for a campground and we let them stay in our converted garage. And, they came inside and visited and my kids got to experience people from another culture. And I remember my parents, when I was a kid, they met some Israelis who were living on a kibbutz and traveling around the United States. And they invited them over to like spend the night in our house or come over for a meal or something. And so it was modeled for me to entertain strangers. And we've really done that in our home, like had had people that, when we were missionaries in Mexico, we would host families in our home that we didn't know at all. And so I think it's been a practice of ours, and it doesn't have to start big like that. Like if you have a neighbor, take them some cookies or invite them over for tea. Like one of the biggest epidemics in the country is loneliness. And I think that was one of the things I loved about studying like the life of Saint Benedict. The monasteries had an open door policy, but they also kept their values. And I think that's something we have to be kind of think about ahead of time. Because if you're hosting people with kids all the time, and so then your kids are just running around unchecked. And I've heard so many stories of children who get sexually abused at a play group or at a Bible study or in some kind of regular family gathering or regular community gathering. Children get sexually abused by an older kid. That doesn't have to be your story. I think that there has to be some practices ahead of time, like no playing in bedrooms with closed doors, or, we're going to have the kids stay with us for the Bible study, and then we'll all kind of visit and keep an eye on them in some way together. Or maybe even just talking to your kids ahead of time and saying, here are the do not do's, or here are the things to watch out for. So I'm not trying to scare people, but I feel like we can do these like again, the pendulum swing where either you have nobody over and you have no community. And so there's no healthy like interchange or sharing of ideas and comfort and hope, or you can have the opposite where it's like your home is like open all the time and you never really connect with your kids because you're always with your friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see the balance there. I know that I really love hosting, and that whenever I am in the habit of doing that, and currently at this exact moment, I am not. Like, I don't have any regular system of inviting people over. I have in the past. At this exact moment, I don't. And I miss that. That's something that I actually really enjoy doing. I don't mind kids running in and out of my house. I really don't. I don't mind cooking a whole bunch of food. And I think that even my kids thrive off of it because we have that personality. But yeah, it's just a habit, and I guess I forget about it. And maybe it's just because it's the end of winter right now, and that's maybe what
Yeah. And
happens.
also, like, I think for you and I, and for a lot of modern moms, we have built really sweet online communities.
Hmm.
And so to some degree, we're spending a decent amount of time nurturing our online communities. And it does make it a little bit harder to invite people in the little fringe time that we have. But,
Yeah.
like the other night, I invited a friend over, a friend wanted to learn how to knit. And so I was watching my granddaughter, and I had, lots going on that day, but I just hit, hey, want to come over for an hour and we'll knit together. So it wasn't a long time, but I think just being in the practice of,
Yeah.
a once a week, at least opening your doors in some way, whether it's an impromptu, just stop by, or whether it's a actual, invitation to a party. So, and I do kind of spell out in the book a few different things that we've done. Like we've hosted Passover, or we've hosted a little spring party where we all decorated Easter eggs together, which I know that sounds weird that we did Passover and Easter eggs, but we are weird. So.
Good excuse to get together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I know some families who model this really, really well. And like I said, I've been in and out of that. And you're right about the online community because I interact with so many people, but then I forget that nobody else in my family does that. Nobody else. Like my husband doesn't interact with people online. My kids don't interact with people online. And so, that's something that I have to remember, that I'm the only one who's actually partaking in that community aspect. I mean, we have church and we go to, Wednesday night and Sunday and all that good stuff, but like inviting people in my home, you're saying weekly basis, that would be a big step up from what I'm currently doing.
Yeah. And, I mean, okay, what about bi-weekly? What about Sunday after church? Like, and I think, unfortunately, it hasn't been cultivated to anybody. So probably you're the one who mostly hosts and people aren't necessarily inviting you over. And so I
Yeah.
think that it is tricky because it's hard if it's always on you. But I think, even if you're just meeting in a park, because it does, I have read a couple things lately that talk about how important it is, even if people have gone through a hard time. Like for some people, like, the whole COVID season was a really hard time, but we heal in community, like just by talking. When you get together with your friends in person, you talk about what a hard day you had with your kids, like that brings a lot of comfort, and we can do that online. And I think that many of us are building close communities online, but there is something different about like being able to give each other a hug then. You know what I mean? Being able to actually look each other in the eyes, I think brings that comfort and that healing to a whole new level.
And something that I think changed, because I'm thinking back to my early motherhood, I met up with people at the park nonstop. Like it
Yeah.
was my lifeline because I didn't have anything on, I didn't have the internet, when I was first a mom at all. Didn't have a smartphone till I had already had kids for 7, 8 years. And so I regularly met up with friends at the park. And something that I think has changed, not just the internet, but also in the last, I'd say 4 years, the battle lines have been clearly drawn. And we don't get together with people who aren't exactly like us. And that's, how do I
Mm.
find another homeschooling large, like, you know what I mean? Like, this is, I'm I'm saying that that's wrong to think that like somebody has to be exactly like you to want to have community with them. I was listening to a podcast recently and she was really talking about how much we miss out, and people think, if you're having community, that must be because there's a lot of people like you in your area. And she was
Mm.
saying, no, it's because I hang out with people who aren't exactly like me, right?
Yeah. And there's so much growth available in that. But, I love what you said about meeting at the park, because for the last 3 years until this year, we were part of a homeschool co-op, and most of the kids were much younger than my children. My children, my oldest was the only girl her age,
Yes, I find that
but
all the time with homeschool groups.
yes,
You're the only, nobody has
yes,
teenagers.
exactly. But I'm like, you know what? This is our community service. It looks good on a college transcript to have community service. So even though these are younger kids, you're going to go and kind of be a helper. But it was like it was so low pressure. Like we met in a park. So none of us had to clean our houses or clean up
Right.
after a bunch of messy kids or something. But it was just such a comforting time to be able to get together and talk about what was happening in the world and talk about what was happening in our families, and feel like we had real people, real neighbors, that if we were having a struggle, they would be there, that, we could take each other a meal if we had a baby or had a surgery or something. So I think it's really special to cultivate it, even in our day and age where we can cultivate online community as well.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we think that the people we get together with have to be our age or have kids the same age as our kids, or, it doesn't, we look around and we think, well, there's nobody, who would I get together with? And that is definitely something to watch if you're thinking that. I don't know. I think that only has really been the case in the last few years that we're so divided like that, like religion, politics, just everything. So, anyways, it
Yeah.
really spoke to me when somebody was saying that on their podcast. I'm like, I think that is, especially too, because we can on the internet get people so like us that we're used to just being in our little bubbles, right?
Yeah. And I think it's really destructive for our society when we can only hang out with people who are just like us. I think that is part of,
Mm-hmm.
what they did, like the powers that be or whatever. I think we're on purpose dividing us, like dividing the old against the young with like the fears of getting sick from COVID, and dividing races with all of what was going on. So I feel like we do love each other a lot more than the news would like us to believe.
What about homeschooling? For those homeschool moms, I think we have sometimes pressure that we put on ourselves that isn't really necessary. And that can make it to where we feel like there's no margin for anything else. Have you noticed that people have, like, homeschooling can actually be simplified in a way?
Oh, 100%. I'm so glad you brought this up. Like, really, I've read quite a few books by John Taylor Gatto. And if you are
Yes.
homeschooling, you need to read his books, because it will really take that pressure off. Like, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I should be testing my kids more, or they should be, they should be doing more. If you read his books, you will kind of breathe a sigh of relief, because he says a couple of different places that all of the learning necessary for success in high school can be taught in only 2 or 3 years or 100 hours of formal skill study.
Right.
And so, in the younger years, you really can focus on reading out loud, talking about what you read, letting your children act out what they read through their play, teaching them chores, teaching them to love others. They're teaching them how to do like the practical skills of, mixing up a batch of cookies or helping to change a baby's diapers. Those are really good motor skills, actually, that will help them be better at academics. They will have better fine motor skills for writing. And the truth is, life in the world is changing rapidly. I feel like we still need to know how to read widely. We still need to know how to handwrite. We need to know how to type. But now, like, if you want to find anything out, you can find it out. And what we need even more is like critical thinking skills, good
Mm-hmm.
character, relational skills,
Yeah.
and also like a wealth of hope. And so in our homeschool in the early years, like we focus a lot on just reading the most beautiful stories, reading the stories that will help your children feel hopeful about the future, that will portray good character. Like Charlotte Mason, she didn't necessarily advocate teaching character through little character cards. She wanted you to teach it through stories. And so maybe it's a story in your own life. Like, my dad, they didn't have hardly any money and they moved away from their family, but they worked really hard and God provided. Little stories like that help your children know how to live. But when we get stressed, we start focusing on using like teacher materials, stuff from
Worksheets.
schools, worksheets that
Yes.
have like no character. Like they're little stories that have no depth. They will not
Mm-hmm.
engage your children. Your children will not think about them after they read them. They will not act out the game. It will not later on help them have hope. Some families in my community are reading the Endurance about Ernest Shackleton. And it's this amazing survival story. And, one of her children remarked that, oh my goodness, they would never have survived if Ernest Shackleton hadn't been such a good leader. So these are the stories that will engage your children's minds and they will think about them long after. But if you take the shortcut of like an online learning program for all the subjects or worksheets for all the subjects so you can prove they learned something, they
Right.
will get some knowledge, but there won't be any depth to it. And the people with the depth and the creativity and the imagination and the character, those are the people who will be shaping culture in the future, because the rest of them, they will go along with whatever is told them because all they've learned how to do is take in information and put it out.
Yes, 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 yes. I was having this conversation with another mom at co-op the other day, and I'm very passionate about this. And I don't talk about it. I guess I do talk about it somewhat often, but I'm always a little bit afraid of what certain people are going to think when I talk about this. But I talk about it in my real life a lot. And I was talking about with another mom, and she was like, I believe everything you're saying. I completely agree. Just in practice, I can't. I feel I still have the fears of, we're supposed to be doing this, this, and this. So like she knows that we're not really doing school at home, but yet she can't quite move away from it. Like she understood that all makes sense. You're going to learn more that way. That simplifies school. It's almost like if you put a mother who is interested in stories and ideas and like eager to learn with children without a smartphone, just let them be. That's what's going to happen naturally without any pressure at all. But for some reason, it's like, it can't be that easy. Like that just, learning and exploring and stories, it can't be that easy. Like it's
Yeah.
somehow not
I
right.
know, which unfortunately our confidence has been educated out of us. Like so many of us were
Yes.
a product of the public school system where we're like, oh, I have to have the right answer for the teacher. I won't pass. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Like we're
And so
still
a lot of,
struggling with that
yeah,
idea. That's
yeah,
what she was
totally. We're
saying
still
too.
struggling to have that authority or that confidence. And,
That
and,
authority,
and I
right?
mean, yeah, it's really important, especially now where we see culture changing so rapidly and people just kind of going along with things that are actually really destructive. Like people should be able to say, no, 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 this is wrong. This is destructive. And yet people just go along with it because they're too afraid to be different. And that's part of what is really trained into us in institutional schooling, is that we should all be the same. And that's a very
Mm-hmm.
ungodly idea. Like God created us all in his image, but we're all like unique and special in different parts of the body. And yet the institutional schooling would like us to be like just this one organism that they can easily move however they want to.
Read John Taylor Gatto. That's what she's that's what she's referencing. I mean, the thing is it should be alarming if everything in the world, like you mentioned, everything's changing so fast. So like what I learned in college is basically completely irrelevant. I graduated in '07. And so all the way that, you communicate with people as far as marketing, I majored in marketing. The way that you market and communicate with people is totally different now. It's nothing the same. But it should be alarming when you see that mostly education kind of functions the same when the world's changing this fast. Yet, it should be obvious to us that to create creative, free thinking people would be more important than somebody who can like quickly do exactly what the teacher wants them to do.
Absolutely, especially in this culture, in this time period, to have the humanities, to have like the character and the worldview and the hope and like primary sources. Read your children the Constitution, read your children the Bible, things that have stood the test of time, instead of filling up their time with twaddle and then expecting them to be able to be thinkers, critical thinkers who can navigate a rapidly changing world.
Yes, yes. So much good stuff. All right. Well, tell the listeners where they can find you, where they can connect with you, and find their own copy of Habits for a Sacred Home.
Yeah. So you can go to habitsforasacredhome.com to find the book. There's some really sweet pre-order bonuses there, a poetry pack of some of the poems and prayers that we're working through this year in the Restoration Home community. And then you can also find me on Instagram at Jennifer Pepito, or thepeacefulpress.shop is where you can find my homeschool resources.
All such good stuff. This is reminding me, whenever I have a conversation like this, I remember whenever I first started homeschooling and I loved it because all of this, like reading stories and exploring nature with my kids was so exciting to me. And it doesn't not have to be that way just because they're older. You know, there's so much to explore. There's so much to learn that's actually very exciting. It's an exciting world. So
it's so true. And I've had children who went on and graduated from high school, graduated from college. I have a daughter who's getting ready to turn in her dissertation for a Juris Doctorate. And so you can homeschool your children and they will, and in this way, with the reading and the practical skills and the great discussions and the life experiences, and they can go on and do whatever they want. We've seen that throughout history.
That's important to note because I do get that a lot. Like, well, what if your child wants to be this? And I'm saying, I'm not throwing that out. Yeah. This is just a way to get there too.
Absolutely.
So yes. Well, thank you so much. This has been very encouraging.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. It's a joy to chat with you.
Right. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. If you have not yet checked out the book on pre-order, make sure it will be down in the description box below or the show notes, depending on where you're listening. To check that out, I think that you are going to be very encouraged by it in creating habits and simplicity in your home. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode of the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast.